Okay, woohoo. Okay, thank you for attending our third installment of Beyond Carceral Feminism. We're going to be talking about abolitionist responses to gender-based and sexual violence. I'm just going to flick through really quickly some definitions, just so everybody's on the same page. So what is carceral feminism? As defined by Victoria law, carceral feminism describes an approach that sees increased policing, prosecution and imprisonment as the primary solution to violence against women. Or non-binary people, doesn't have to be women. This stance does not acknowledge that police are often purveyors of violence and that prisons are always sites of violence. Carceral feminism ignores the way in which race, class, gender identity and immigration status leave certain people more vulnerable to violence than greater criminalization often places these same people at risk of state violence. Transformative justice is a political framework and approach for responding to violence, harm and abuse. At its most basic, it seeks to respond to violence without creating more violence and or engaging in harm reduction to lessen violence. TJ can be thought of as a way of making things right, getting in right relation or creating justice together. Transformative justice responses and interventions do not rely on the state, so police, prisons, or the criminal legal system, foster care systems, although TJ, okay, do not reinforce or perpetuate violence such as oppressive norms or vigilantism, and most importantly, actively cultivate the things we know prevent violence, such as healing, accountability, resilience, and safety for all involved. That is definition by Transform Harm. Prison industrial complex is, or PIC for short, is a term used to describe the overlapping interests of government and industry that use surveillance, policing, and imprisonment as solutions to economic, social, and political problems. Through its reach and impact, the PIC helps and maintains the authority of people who get their power through racial, economic, and other privileges. I think we all know what the PIC is. I'm just going to click on because I'm very scared of the time right now. Click through that. Racial capitalism, the process of deriving social and economic value from another person of a different racial identity, predominantly used to insinuate the derivation of value from those of a non-white POC identity. However, a person of any race might engage in racial capitalism, as might an institution dominated by one particular race. The elementary thesis of this concept is capitalism as an economic system subsists on the perpetual accumulation of capital at an increasing rate of said accumulation, and capital can only accumulate by producing and moving through relations of severe inequality among human groups. Therefore, for capitalism to survive, it must exploit and prey upon the unequal differentiation of human value. That's a lot in there. Maybe, Albert, if you can pop those definitions into the doc, just so everybody can see them. That's very wordy. Okay, so I'm going to start by... Right, so thinking of all those definitions, we're going to be expanding on some of those topics, and we'll also be working through some of the understandable common fears and concerns regarding abolition and sexual violence. So I'm going to start off by talking a little bit of the history of Vawa, 1994, so it's Violence Against Women Act, as an example of carceral feminism and how it incited more harm and violence against the very people that the Act and its lobbyists claimed it would protect. I'm not going to be saying anything new here or for the rest of the evening. I'm going to be quoting heavily from an article written by Victoria Law, which is added into the reading list, so you can revise if later on if you want. So in 1994, Vawa was passed, which deployed more police and introduced more punitive sentencing in an attempt to reduce domestic violence. In 1999, Cherry Williams, a black African American living in the Bronx, was beaten and left in an empty parking lot by the police officers she'd called in response to her abusive boyfriend. Many of the feminists who had lobbied for the passage of Vawa remained silent about Williams and countless other women whose 911 calls resulted in more violence. Often white, well-heeled feminists, their legislative accomplishment did little to stem violence against less affluent, more marginalised women like Williams. I bring this example up because this act is a perfect example of carceral feminism. It ignores the ways in which intersections of race, class, gender identity, and immigration status leave certain women more vulnerable to violence, and that greater criminalisation often places these same women at risk of state violence. Casting police and prisons as the solution to domestic violence both justifies and increases police and prison budgets, and diverts attention away from programs that enable survivors to escape, such as shelters, public housing, and welfare. It is important to mention, however, that Vawa is US law, but carceral feminism does exist here in Ireland too, with the existence of Turn Off the Red Light campaign, or TORL for short, which advocates for legislation to address sex work and human trafficking. Sex work has always existed and will always exist for as long as we are around, and we need to create safer environments and conditions for sex workers. Stop trying to control bodies and not give more power to punitive systems which do little to address underlying systems of violence and only create more harm for the people they claim to protect, as we have previously discussed. TORL was also instrumental in Ireland's import of the so-called Nordic model, which is our current model, with the 2017 Criminal Law and Sexual Offences Act, which only puts sex workers at higher risk of experiencing harm. This law puts sex workers at risk who may be living together for safety by retaining brothel keeping as an offence, and paradoxically turns the purchase of sex or services into a crime while leaving their sale legal. The incarceration of 2 migrant women in Kildare for the supposed offence of brothel keeping, one of whom was pregnant at the time of her incarceration, suggests that the law is not protecting the people it claims to protect, or rather the law and the punitive system is working exactly as it should and means to function. Carceral feminism also exists within our more well-known organisations, which spearhead a lot of the conversations surrounding sexual abuse in Ireland, with Nolene Blackwell from the Rape Crisis Centre calling for harsher sentences for abusers. So to give you an example, and I'm going to just do a little disclaimer here, the next part might be a little bit triggering for some of you. So in 2018, a woman in Belfast was brutally raped by abusers Paddy Jackson, Stuart Alding, Blaine McIlroy, and Rory Harrison. In 2018, these men were found not guilty in the eyes of the law on all counts. I ask now, how often are abusers charged or incarcerated? And if they are incarcerated, well, what then? If these men were put into prison for 100 years each, what would have changed? Would anything have changed? Would that woman who experienced that harm have felt any safer? Would any of us here? The criminal justice only re-traumatizes survivors of sexual violence, as it forces survivors to recount in depth a traumatic experience before a panel of strangers who effectively judge whether you are telling the truth or not, as we can see with the advent of the I Believe Her and Me Too hashtag. Some of you might remember that. The prison system and carceral logic does little to answer the questions of why do people commit sexual violence, or why do people harm others? Even more, it does nothing to undo or prevent harm. It perpetuates that cycle of violence. Furthermore, calling the cops is simply not an option for some people, namely undocumented people or people who have precarious immigration status. Borders and fear of deportation prevents some people who are migrants, who are experiencing intimate partner violence specifically, from seeking help. According to the findings of a study mentioned in an article written by Shaman Malkmian, Gardaí have an unwritten policy of referring suspected undocumented people to the Garda National Immigration Bureau, or GNIB, for investigation following the conclusion of an inquiry into domestic or non-domestic abuse. So essentially they'll use information to further prosecute you even after you've said that you're in trouble. How can we possibly reconcile with a punitive system that persecutes the most marginalized, precarious, and vulnerable in our society? We can't. The solution must be collective-based, and unlike the carceral system, there cannot be one single monolithic solution. Another common concern is folks wondering, okay, well, we've abolished the prisons and police, but what are we going to do with the people we can't get to? As in, what are we going to do with the people who we can't change? What are we going to do to the people that will still want to commit harm? Abolition is a long-term campaign. Abolition is about transforming power in communities. And until we get to those people who can't be changed, imagine if we took the time to get started. Abolition is not necessarily a project to end all violence. I think that's important to say, or to say that no harm is ever going to occur again. What it is a commitment and a practice that says we are going to deal with violence drastically differently. We're not going to disappear away anybody. We are going to transform the way we relate to each other so that the possibility of harm and violence will be drastically reduced. To round up, I'd like to say that it is so human of you to want another person to suffer the way that you've suffered if you've experienced harm. We have learned that the punitive system is the only way that we can hold another human being accountable to seek justice. Your feelings of anger and rage and fear are valid and justified when egregious harm has been enacted onto you. What abolition is not the absence of these emotions, but a mutual agreement or a communal agreement that a communal agreement that an understanding that violence begets more violence, and the only way we can begin to imagine a world that is safer for us all is if we fundamentally shift power, organize resources, and a relationship to capitalism in the long term, now and beyond. Abolition is as much about presence as it is about absence. Okay, that is the spiel done. Sorry if I was talking for a little bit too long. At this point, maybe do we want to go for the first breakout session? The first breakout session, we're going to think about, people who abuse, rape, or do harm are in our workplaces, our colleges, our neighborhoods, in our organizing spaces, and our homes right now. What are we doing about those people now, and what can we do about those people now? We don't necessarily have to brainstorm like, oh, this is like the answer. It's just going to be a discussion and possible. It's the purpose of this breakout session is to try and get away from a punitive mindset. So don't feel any pressure to come up like with steps right now. You know, that's okay if you don't have to do that. Albert, will we go to the breakout session?
Go ahead. I don't know if you want to start, Yurika.
Okay. Yeah, I might as well. So we talked about like the systems that are already in place at the moment to deal with issues of sexual violence. And what is in place is Whisper Network.
Report has started.
Oh. Can I talk again? Intro to me.
No, please go for it.
Can you hear me?
I don't know why it was so late. Yeah.
Okay, so we talked about Sprint Networks, which are the sort of systems that are in place now. And we didn't really say that they're like the best system that's in place. But that's what's happening at the moment. So I mentioned the Twitter lists that were going around a few months ago. It was lists of abusers, I think specifically in like the music industry. I was saying how that was frustrating because there was all these lists, but there was like kind of like they were out in the open, but there was nothing going to be done after But yeah, that was one thing we mentioned. We also were talking about workplace examples of gender and sexual violence or abuse or just like dodgy behavior or like breaches of boundaries, and how a lot of this like cultural stuff that's like interwoven in these workplaces or institutions like could be addressed as in preventative measures. So like boundary work, like teaching people boundaries or like being aware of other people's boundaries. Um, and then we also talked about like something that kind of wove through all of our examples was that whenever there's issues of um, sexual violence in workplaces, that management are not good at dealing with it. So like higher levels are never really good at dealing with it, and it oftentimes falls on the shoulders of junior staff or people who are like more precarious in that workplace to deal with that issue. So like yeah, higher management always failing staff at protecting others. And then we also talked about one intersection of racism and sexual violence, where this person who was Spanish was sort of being grubbed in an uncomfortable situation in a workplace, and it was, there was this horrible racist mentality that, like people of a certain ethnicity are more precocious, or not precocious. Somebody did tell me that word. Um, than promiscuous. Why can't I think of that word? Promiscuous than, or like, are just promiscuous. So like that was sort of an example we finished off. Um, if anybody else would want to go next and talk about what their group talked about, would be cool.
I can go.
Yes.
Our group, same thing. We talked about kind of where we're at now. We specifically were looking kind of at, organizing spaces like the left, or, group dynamics. And yeah, it was talked about the whisper networks. And then we talked about like whisper networks. They're often feminized, they're often stigma around it, and often all of the work around dealing with sexual violence falls to women and like feminized people generally as like reproductive labor. But then it's like, so then instead of whisper networks, because that kind of feels like gatekeeping in a way, it should be made public. But then if it's made public, then it kind of stigmatizes that person who is, redeemable, because we're all redeemable, but then they become unredeemable in this way because they're seen as the abuser. And we talked about the fact that we all have the capacity to do harm and to be harmed, and so that there's not one abuser and one victim. We all have those identities at different times, so that we really need to remember that, because if we don't remember that, then it becomes much easier to look at someone as unredeemable. And then we also talked about, in our spaces, really the only two options that we've seen used are whisper networks or expulsion. And then we talked about how expulsion is actually a carceral response. Maybe it's not the carceral state, but it's still a carceral like punishment response. And then we had the question about the balance between, because expulsion is a carceral response and it doesn't actually, it just disappears the problem, but there's also an issue of safety within a group dynamic. It's not a safety in terms of like the world, because we can't always be safe in the world. Even if you expel one abuser, there's still many more abusers, but in a small setting, it is a safety concern for people. And so we didn't come up with an answer to that. That was an issue. And one more thing that I was going to say that I didn't get a chance to say in the group was, because people were saying, it's often all this transformative justice stuff is very theory based and not necessarily concrete, like in this situation you do this, because we don't necessarily have one size fits all thing, but there is a good resource, Creative Interventions. It's a huge toolkit, but a piece of that, or a piece that came from that, is The Revolution Starts at Home. It was a zine, and now it's a book that you can get from AK Press, but it's a PDF. Like, you can find the PDF online. I think it might even be in our reading list. But those are some concrete examples of abusive situations and how they were dealt with, either well or not well. And yeah, it gives some examples of that. So that's all.
Should I go next?
Amazing.
Anto here?
Yeah, go for it.
All right. So I hope I will. I can say a good summary of what. Okay. First of all, was pretty much just removing the abuser in itself doesn't solve the problem. It's just a response that doesn't work in the long term. So this was the approach initially. It was also said and stressed, this is very important, being capable of identify and name the mechanisms or the dynamics of abuse, because sometimes it's very subtle, it's very liminal in a sense, so it's not something that can clearly be identified and be contrasted. So to contrast this, to contrast the rape culture that was highlighted, people must be aware of that type of dynamics. So provide a counterculture against the rape culture. And that means that we can build a sort of preventative measures, in a sense. And in that type of approach, we can find possibly, but it's not clear. It's something we can build based on examples and experiences already done. We can build favorable spaces, like spaces where everybody can be accountable and safe at the same time. I hope I did not forget, but it was a very, very interesting and participated discussion. So thanks, everybody.
I can go next. It's Nicole here. I started off by saying that it's very interesting and telling that talking about gender-based and sexual violence is usually the stick to beat abolitionists with, but because it's been a while now and abolition is no longer trending on Twitter, ACAB isn't as trendy anymore. There's so many less people signing up. So it just shows that a lot of people want to use this as a thing, but they don't want to do the work to talk about what we can really do. And we were talking about how, first of all, what we do right now is very punitive and it tears families apart, especially if you're part of a marginalized group. And then the three of us kind of shared individual responses and responsibilities we have to each other as a community, just the classic things that we were taught growing up, if you're going on a date or wherever, tell a friend, or this person will ring you in an emergency, and we're all have the keys but between your knuckles, all that kind of thing. We have these ways to equip ourselves as individual responses and responsibilities, and kind of an example of communities looking out for each other in a way, but also we're not dealing with the abusers at all in our current system in this way, because it's all about the individual and what we're not doing and what we're doing to stop the situation. It doesn't address systems of oppression or any of the power dynamics in the situation. And the other thing we were talking about was how, like, so many things that we can do, leading to the second part, is it requires so much imagination that it is a lot of work. And we were saying that it's really nice to have this space to come together and say we don't know the concrete answers, because we are saying, like, by being here is saying we're humble enough to say we don't know the answers that will address all these issues, because there is no standard way of dealing with abuse and harm and violence. And even within, like, what is called transformative justice, there's so many different ways of doing it. Like, I've read, like, you know, a lot of very formal circles being formed and, like, very defined roles and people as you know, safety person or whatever, and then very informal structures. So even within, like, those frameworks, there's so many different ways of doing things. That it kind of, like, it's even harder for us to convince people. But I think it's nice, at least now, that we have a space to talk about how we don't know for sure, without having to be constantly on the defense about it. Because I feel like that's a lot of what abolitionists have to put up with, is like, what about this? What about this? But, like, just being able to come together and say, like, well, we're not sure, but we want to try our best, because capitalism and imprisonment and the PIC definitely isn't the answer. And then we were going to get into more of transformative justice, and then it stopped, and we always need more time. But that was really it.
Has everybody gone? Yes. Okay. Yes, I know. This topic is always the, what did you say, the stick that beats abolition work. And I know, like, I'm kind of done with, like, answering that or, like, countering people when they ask that question, because I know it's being asked disingenuously. Like, there's so much literature. Like, if even with the reading list, I barely scraped the surface, or we barely scraped the surface. Like, there's so much out there. Conversations that have happened for, like, decades. Like, people have sat around tables and talked about this stuff for decades in so many different countries. Like, it's all out there. The work is out there. So, like, when people ask that question, I'm like, you know what? Just, I can't. No, I know I need to be more patient with that. But yeah, it's a disingenuous question. I also appreciate that Emily brought up that whisper networks and current responses are oftentimes feminized. I think that's really important. And feminized, like, in a derogatory sense, as is, like, the nature of reproductive labor. And also, yes, so, like, this system of expulsion, expulsing the abuser, and sort of just, like, washing your hands of them is hard and, like, not the right way. Like, yeah, you need to think about the safety of the community and what that community needs at the moment. But in the end, that abuser is just going to move on to the next community. So yeah, I do agree that there needs to be something else in place, rather than, like, yeah, expulsion following on the logic of the carceral system, which is also, like, really similar to cancel culture. This idea of just, like, if I don't see it, it doesn't exist, la la la, bye bye. And what else did we talk about? Yeah, having, like, a counterculture as a preventive measure. I think that's, like, the most important thing. And, like, yeah, as we mentioned, there is, like, so many different ways and methodologies in abolition work, and, like, tactics and resolutions are different in all different communities. Like, and that's also I suppose it's a weakness when we're talking about abolition that there is not one answer, but I think it's a strength, and it's like a testament to abolition that there isn't one single dogmatic solution. So yes, at the same time, it's really annoying when we're like trying to convince people to talk about it, but I think it's like a testament to it's the practice in essentially. Anyway, do we want to go for a comfort break? How is everybody feeling?
Yeah, I think it'd be nice. It's been an hour.
In what?
It's been an hour, so will we do 5
Yeah.
minutes?
Yeah, I'm gonna make a cup of tea.
Yeah,
So-
come back at 10 past.
Yeah, come back at 10 past.
Okay.
Okay.
I'm just going to play some relaxing tunes in the meantime.
Do you want to stop recording?
Yeah. Whoever wants to start, I don't know if Yorica again wants to start, or Antonella.
Yeah, I can start. Yurika was with me as well, so I can go.
Go for it.
So like we had a really interesting chat, and we talked about how, like, answering the first question, we talked about how the police or anyone in the criminal justice system is truly like the last people or institutions we think of when we've suffered harm, to seek help from, and whether it's sexual harm or not. And in such a case, then, like really what, like we talked about how, and like the reading sort of compound this, what we already know, that if people are not even reporting the violence that they face, then clearly the who is the system for, right? And we talked about how what we usually need in instances of having suffered harm, sexual or otherwise, is usually a collective to feel safe. We talked about how collective community care is really what makes us feel safe, if we feel safe with the community around us, but how that also requires a lot of consent of everybody involved, and how it involves consent of all those who are agreeing to not cause further harm in making you feel safe, and that there needs to be an understanding of how no one that you cannot have a punitive process in place, because then the abuser or anyone who causes harm will never really want to even apologize or want to get involved in the process of accountability, if there's a threat of having punitive action taken against them. And lots of times we also talked about I believe her, and how, like, despite the way that movement sort of, transformed and ended up becoming, and what believing her entailed, despite that, lots of times, having suffered harm, most survivors, including those of us who were in the group and talking, just want acknowledgement that there was harm, and to be believed, really. And that cannot happen in the current punitive system. You cannot have an acknowledgement of harm if there's threat of being arrested. So that's kind of basically what we talked about. We also, towards the end, had like a really interesting discussion, but like as per usual time. But we had a really interesting discussion where it came up. Well, what do you do in situations where you don't want to make things worse by intervening, as a member of a community? If someone in your community is facing harm, how do you know whether it's the right move to sort of get involved? And we were in the middle of having this conversation, and so we had to end it. But it started some really interesting cogs turning. So yeah.
Thanks so much, Sahar. I don't know who wants to go next. Maybe Anto. Sorry, I just saw your name there. Go ahead.
Yeah, we agreed that this time it won't be me doing the reporting. I swear it was agreed. It was not me escaping this. Okay, it's
It
because
was
that
agreed.
basically, yeah, the discussion was so good, so rich that my poor English won't give justice to our conversation. So yeah, let's go, Nick, and possibly Ala as well.
So when we actually started, we actually shared really powerful testimonies. And I think one individual, I don't know if she wants her name to be known, but the mentioning of the queer community being, highly policed just because they're gender non-conforming was very powerful. And there, others also, but that one kind of resonated very deeply to others. As for discussing the ways that we are now safe, from those who have experienced violence all their lives to kind of come out and form relationships with other people that are healthy can be quite a difficult journey. So just the idea of putting yourself out there can be quite anxiety filled, and sadly it can actually go wrong, but there are times where it can go right. So really you have to put yourself out there first, but eventually you will find through experience the right ones. Communication was something that was really resonating strongly with all the members in the room about how important it is to have that open communication, to have a safer space, and in that kind of brought in consent. The idea of having each other's back even inside your own home is a really vital one. As for communities, we were speaking about structures being in place. We had a member mention that even if you are in a workplace, there's a culture within that workplace that can actually redirect you to key people, even outside the workplace, that can help you out. So that was a really good one. And when we came to look at cultivating culture of safety and actually exporting that, we spoke about needing a reach out, but we also spoke about accessibility, language, and the kind of like removing the intimidation of just how, I guess, intellectual it can be at times, is really important to actually bring more people on board, because by default, majority of the queer community and the trans community, for example, may already be aligning themselves with abolitionist values and beliefs, but aren't really aware of it. So how do you reach out to them and bring them in? So yes, I think that's all that we discussed, unless anybody else would like to add.
That was amazing. Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Brilliant.
Thank you, guys.
I don't know who wants to go ahead next.
I can go. So we didn't really get to the second one, but we spent a fair bit of time talking about our experiences, whether it be our own personal ones or people that we know. And I think it just opening up that topic, and to what Eureka said at the beginning about how we are all survivors, or how we have all such diverse lived experiences, but harm and violence is something that we can't seem to escape from. And what we've all talked about is just like what we need in those instances. Well, in that moment, we need community, we need friendship and care, healthcare, especially. People were comforted by kind of certain parts of the clinical system that were good, and I think it shows how important it is that people are compassionate in those settings. And when people were in distress, there were certain helplines that weren't as comforting. And we also talked about how important it was, and I think this is about like the importance of political education and sex ed in schools everywhere as well, because we were talking about how we didn't have the language to articulate or even know it was rape at the time, and coming to terms with what happened to you or someone else like after an event like that, and how you deal with that trauma then. We also talked about the dichotomy between like suffering privately if you don't report it, and it's like you're just being presented with these two options of private or public kind of humiliation, and how nothing will you're being told nothing will get done if you don't report, but in reality if you report you're being subjected to a really violent system that makes you rehash everything, and oftentimes they don't believe you if you report. And someone else mentioned that like none of their friends have ever reported any experiences that they've had to the police. And I also mentioned that a lot of the times it's the police that are abusers and landlords, and they know that they hold that power and are in that position of power, and so they fulfill that role perfectly as someone who is capable of continuing violence against people and not suffering under the consequences. And I think we need to go back to the beginning of what we were talking about, how this system isn't broken, it's working perfectly fine for people in power, and to let violence and harm persist.
Perfect. I think that's everybody who's spoken and recounted what was being said in the groups. First of all, I want to thank everybody who shared their stories. This has been a really intense evening. And do have a cup of tea and wrap yourself in a blanket after this. So yeah, thank you for being so frank, everybody, first of all. So some of the things that were brought up, for a lot of people here, going to the police is not an option anyway. And there's this like mentality that just go to the police when it's really serious. So like crisis point, need to go to the police, which isn't helpful either. And the way like the carceral system and the punitive system measures degrees of harm, but harm is subjective to the person who has experienced that harm. So what can an external system or an external set of rules or laws do and say? Like it's kind of like a form of gaslighting. I think Emily said it during our breakout session, that having to prove your hurt and harm is like basically like being gaslighted again. Another thing that was mentioned that I'd like to sort of bring in this wrap up is that not all harm is criminalized and not all crime is harm. So meaning that, and sort of linking back in with what Sahar said, that we have this system, but who is it really for? Which is it's not for us. It's for people who are in power, or who have access to the most resources, or is to perpetuate this cycle of harm continuously. What else would we talk about? Yeah, I think accessibility is really important as well. I think it was Allah who said that. I apologize if I'm pronouncing your name wrong. But I think we have practiced abolition before, in our spaces in small degrees or large. We don't necessarily have or people don't necessarily have the language to describe that, but I think it is happening already. It is, I think that's the importance of political education, is to sort of like create that link of like, actually, I am doing this thing and like, this is what it is, which is like transformative justice. So I think that's important to note. Another thing that Nicole said that was really important was harm and violence. Like we can't escape it. It's there. It's like the nature of human beings. But I think it's important to sort of just keep talking and keep creatively imagining systems that are not carceral or punitive, because they're not working for us. They're working exactly as it should, but they're not working for us. And I think that's it. I can't talk anymore, guys. I'm so sorry. If anybody else would like to add anything or share anything that they felt that affected them profoundly, or they felt that was important, please, the floor is yours. That was a wrap up, by the way. So if anybody else has anything to add.
I just want to add, if you are feeling tired or feel like you need more professional help, there's loads of helplines, and I'd be happy to send on a follow-up email with several helplines. But I do know that I wasn't in the breakout room that talked about which one wasn't helpful, so I don't want to be giving you ones that wasn't helpful. But thank you so much for coming. This is a really important topic to talk about, I think. And even though we don't have as many people as for other topics, I think that any small change we can do, even within ourselves, to challenge the carceral logic around sexual violence is really helpful. I don't have anything else to say. I don't know if anybody else from MERJ or anybody from the audience wants to say anything.
I might jump in. I just had said that I didn't find the Dublin rape crisis or the rape crisis line helpful, but I think that may have been my individual experience with one individual that I talked to, so I wouldn't dissuade other people from calling them if they feel like such a line would be helpful for them.
I would also just like to say that, you know, one of the things that we talked about earlier, or that Eureka talked about, was the fact that, you know, a lot of these services are run by carceral feminists. And so that can often affect how we feel about interacting with them. And again, like, MERJ is not we're not a service provider, but we do believe in mutual aid, and whatever we can do. I mean, that's why we have these conversations. They're hard, but whatever we can do to be a resource for people, I think we're happy to do that. I just also wanted to say thank you to everyone. Like, it's a really good conversation. I've been doing this work for a very long time, and every single time we have one of these new things come up, and like new ways of thinking about things come up, because we have to figure this out together, right? I'd also like to say, like, we have loads of resources. We've shared loads of resources. Sometimes it just seems like too much, but we're going to continue this series, and through the series we can kind of go out as big as you want in terms of scope of abolition. We kind of like started off big, like, you know, what does a world without prisons look like? And now we're kind of going on some individual things, but of course they're all interconnected. And so if, like, this doesn't have to be the last conversation we have on this topic, and we can get more specific about, like, you know, mutual aid responses, or, you know, people who are criminalized after they call the police, or, you know, these kinds of topics. We can continue this, and hopefully we will. But yeah, just, and thanks for everyone for facilitating, and for, yeah, thanks to Albert for doing the technical heavy lifting, and Eureka for organizing the topic.
Can I just jump in really quick and just say, like, it was purely timing, but like, the fact this happened today, I said in the first group that I was in, I was feeling very raw today because I woke up to really horrific news of really bad sexual violence in Pakistan. And my social media and my news feed is just full of every single person I know back home calling for, like, really horrific punitive action and, like, public hangings. Literally, the one thing that is entirely on my newsfeed is hang them all, hang the rapists. And the fact that it was right after all this reading I did for today, and that I was coming here, this has been really, it's been really affirming, because it can be very lonely to be an abolitionist in moments like these. like I felt very alone in my kin today. And so this was a very like coincidentally well-timed and a very important and safe space. So thank you so much. This was just, I just wanted to say that. So thanks.
Thanks so much for sharing, Sahar. And I'm glad that you feel less lonely in being an abolitionist, because it can be a lonely journey, for sure. So I'd say we'll probably leave it there. I'll follow up with the feedback form just to check how you feel about this time as well, like on a Thursday, and anything else you might want to think about for the following webinar. If you have anything specific, like Emily said, we can go as specific as we can think of. So thank you so much. I'm going to end the call here. And have a nice evening. Have a lovely cup of tea and lovely sleep. Night.
Thank you all. Goodbye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.